understand some roasted onions on your balls? So back in the day, what? Let me rewrite the story. Damn, I just spat. Bro, what's going on? Rub some beetroot on your ass and let a dog sniff it. I don't know. Puppy skin. When you think about doctors back in the day, what comes into your mind? A lot of candles, a lot of books that are written in religious and speculative manner, a lot of words but no practices, a lot of cloaks but no effects. Well, you got that right, because back in the day, doctors honestly had no accountability. They had no idea what they were doing, and they were proud of it. They were proud that if you die, and if you die, that was God's work, not his. He can never fail. And they were called not doctors, they were called physicians. So how I got to be thinking about this topic, I was reading the book Homo Deus. You know, it was the beginning of the book. I've been trying to read this book for a really long time, and then I've read The Sapiens a long time ago, and I was like, oh, there's the second one. I bought it straight away, and I decided to read it afterwards. However, that afterwards only came now. Hey, better later than never. I started reading. At the very beginning, it started to talk about how diseases were spreading, how doctors back in the day were treating patients, and I found it absurd. There was so much of it just accidental science. There was no science in sight. It was just belief in nothing. Religion stood in the first place, so their knowledge was very limited. It was a mix of astrology, religion, philosophy, superstition, and guesswork. Guesswork was very famous. Whenever there would be a patient and they would not know what to do with the symptom, they would just start guessing what they could possibly do, and they would test in real time. And I'm talking about 1300s and forward. Even though back in the time there were already universities that have existed in Paris, in Padua, Bologna, many other places. But the entire curriculum was reading ancient Greek and Roman texts that were based on basically belief systems. In those texts, they were also just speculating. Damn, I just spat. They were just speculating on what works. It wasn't even about treating some certain disease. They didn't even know what diseases existed and what viruses existed, and they didn't even know what viruses were in the first place. Then in the universities, they would be debating them, those ideas that were talked about with these Roman and Greek ancient texts, memorizing them because that helps, and never questioning them. Sounds a lot like communist China. But that's a different video. There were no experiments, none. No dissecting bodies, no testing treatments. There were no tests, no hypotheses, no theories, no nada. Just reading old books. And based on reading old books, looking at the history, despite the fact that things have evolved over time, did not matter to them. They wouldn't think, they wouldn't judge, they wouldn't even question the fact that anything have changed or progressed with all the time that have been after these Greek and Roman texts been written. How wonderful! The medicine back then? Don't get me started. And I mean, it was just so very basic. It was pre-science, pre-anatomy, pre-anything that makes sense. It was just herbs, just grass. And sometimes they would have apothecaries. And in these apothecaries, they would just mix and match and see if something would work. Physicians didn't like the people that worked in apothecaries. You know why? Because sometimes the things that were recommended in apothecaries actually worked, and physicians didn't want to admit that. They had beef with those people. And back in the day, doctors, when you actually call them, had no idea what caused the horrible illnesses and diseases which plagued the Middle Ages. They just kind of were roaming around and were like, yo, bro, what's going on? And nobody knew. And for your understanding how bad it got during Black Death in England, 1348 till 1350, roughly, that ages, okay? 1/3 of the population have vanished. Just poof, gone. There were no antibiotics. Causes of illness were based on the ancient teachings of Aristotle. It was assumed that diseases of the body resulted from sin of the soul. Because of that, many people did not even bother with the doctors. Instead, they just sought relief from their ailments through meditation and prayer. They were like, I'ma just go to church and pray that I'm not gonna die. I pray that my 40-degree fever is not going to kill me today. The doctors recommended for them to go to church instead of receive any treatment from them because they were like, bro, I'm not taking the accountability for this. If you die, you die. You gotta be doing that on your own. I got so curious about the fact that there were people, right? You would come to a doctor, physician. You would expect them to have some sort of credibility, for them to have some sort of licensing. But I mean, it's nowadays. People are very meticulous in the way that they choose a doctor, in the way that they choose who is going to treat them, right? Man, I got curious what type of remedies doctors back in the day used to tell patients to do. And people took the absurdities that were told to them and with full-on confidence went and did what the doctors have told them to do. Because some of them really be sounding like rub some beetroot on your ass and let a dog sniff it. That's literally how it sounds like. And you be finding that man with a red ass dead in his bed, and the doctor would come and be like, ooh, that was God's work. It ain't me. I did what I could, you see? He didn't do it the correct way. He should have rubbed it clockwise. He probably did it anti-clockwise. I've done some research, and I shit you not, for cough, what they said, London doctor's remedy, 17th century. Bake a mouse in bread and eat it. You gotta catch a mouse that was in the sewers, got all of the diseases possible because they transmit all of the diseases, but you gonna bake it in bread that was already with a lot of dirt, because as I remember, back in the day, people died from the foods that they were eating as well because there was like lead and some other chemicals as well that were poisoning the public as well. But on top of that, you had to get a rat and bake it in your bread and eat it to treat your cough, because they thought the warm nature of a mice soothed the lungs. Now, for toothache, brace yourselves. Hold a live toad in your mouth until it dies. That was medieval English leech books. The logic behind it back in the day that the toad draws out the poison. But what actually happens is that toad dies of trauma and you get salmonella. Not only you get toothache, but you also get salmonella. You get it? The possibilities of you dying from a tooth or salmonella were like 50-50. So for like inflammatory arthritis that is on your foot, for gout, wrap your feet in puppy skin. Puppy skin! Do you understand that what they said? This was Francis Bacon reports this in 1620, literally skinning a puppy and using it like socks. Skinning a puppy for your arthritis, to put it on your dogs. Maybe that's why the phrase dogs, like calling your feet dogs, that's where it comes from. Actually, I want to find out. No. However, it does make sense. You know, like from back in the day medicine, this one just comes from Cockney rhyming slang. You know, if you look at the history, you skinning a puppy and put it on your feet, that would make so much fucking sense. But however, another very, very important issue that they had quite frequently back in the days, and the doctors were eagerly trying to give you some remedies in order to treat that, was for your swollen testicles. You had to just place roasted onions on your balls. That's Trotula, 12th century. The onion's hot and moist nature supposedly reduced the swelling. I don't know about you, but back in the day, people barely took showers. If you be putting some roasted onions on your balls as well, I can't even imagine the smell. People be walking around with some foul smells around back in the day, and you just with your groin with onion, ugh. Now, you might be wondering, why is there the hot nature of a mice, hot and moist nature of the onion? So back in the day, they had humors, and it's a theory, one of the theories that they were going by. It's called humor theory. The operating system of medieval medicine. They have paid attention to bodily fluids, which are called humors. And the body of the patient was viewed as a part of the universe. There were 4 humors. So there were element fire, which was yellow bile, element element earth, which was black bile, element air, which was blood, and element water, which was phlegm. They had to ensure, the doctors had to ensure that all of these elements are balanced. So if one is off, you had to counterbalance it. So if you're too hot, you had to get cold. If you're too cold, you have to get hot. The theory of opposites. Honestly, some Avatar shit. Now, for impotence, you had to insert powdered dog penis into wine and drink it. What was up with them just skinning puppies and getting dog penises? And this was recorded in European apothecary manuals. I'm not getting this out of my ass. This is actually recorded stuff from history that people were doing and recommending to each other, and nobody questioned it and actually did it. There were some psychos that were doing it and seeing no effect. Or by some magic, like there was a case, you had to stuff bacon fat, pig fat into your nose whenever you have some bleeding, like nosebleeds. But that's just because of salt. The salt stops bleeding. It was accidents. A lot of the times, all of these were just accidents. Like if something worked, it was just out of pure chance. But for impotence, as I was saying, the idea that the virility, the sex drive of the dog transfers to you. So the soul of the dog's sex drive transfers to you. People nowadays are trying to form aura. Back in the day, people were trying to get the aura of a dog. We think that our society is not normal right now. Think about how crazy people used to be back in the day, and they would be agreeing to do such things. But before we move further, I would like for you to understand that there were like a certain class of people that were being called, like there were doctors, which are physicians, and there were other classes that were being called because not everyone could afford a physician, because it was actually for a higher up classes, people that could afford it. There were physicians. They were elite, expensive, unfortunately often useless. Like a lot of the times when you go to a private hospital, peasants rarely saw them, mostly hired by nobility or monasteries. People often joke that a doctor visits the rich to take their money and the poor to take their life. That's how bad it was, because they would just give some useless suggestions or suggestions that didn't help. However, because they had such a, extensive background and their education and their expertise, as they were saying, people were, they thought that they could get their prices up. They thought that they knew what they were doing, even though they could not admit the fact that they did not know, because their ego was eating them alive if they admitted that they don't know something. They were respected in theory, but hated and resented in practice. Then there were surgeons and barbers. They were practical and familiar. People actually liked barbers, surgeons, and midwives. Why, you may ask? Because they actually did something. They set bones, pulled teeth, and delivered babies, unlike physicians. Afterwards, after the surgeons and barbers, they also had fold healers, were trusted even more. And these were the grandmothers, herbalists, village healers, because they had generational knowledge. They already actually knew what worked and what didn't. Unlike physicians, they had no ground for testing. They were not testing, not experimenting, not giving anything to the patients. That's why people hated them, because like, what are you good for? What are you paying for exactly? Lastly, there was religion that influenced trust. If a doctor claimed God works through him, he uses saintly knowledge, he can balance humors as God designed, people trusted that more than science. People were really brainwashed back in the day, because they were thinking like, if you're sinning, like sin equals the fact that you are influencing your blood, and that's why you are going to be diseased. Religion was giving fear amongst public in order to control the public back in the day, and doctors were using that to the full extent to try to also manipulate the people that they were seeing, that they had power as much, and they were comparing themselves to gods because they had some saintly knowledge that other people didn't. Before I move on to some actual cases that have happened in history with those type of doctors and what it had led to, there were some other medical cures that were done, and one of the medical cures was to drink human urine daily for literally everything. Ancient Egyptians, medieval Europe, Victorian Britain, doctors prescribed drinking your own fresh, warm urine for fever, depression, acne, constipation, bad spirits, and it was literally called urotherapy. Another one that was quite gross, okay? Eat dried human feces for epilepsy. This was in ancient Rome, and medieval physicians recommended to collect. You go on a doo-doo, you collect it, you dry it in the sun, or you just do it in the sun and you just leave it there. Grind it and you swallow it. The logic was like this. The dryness counters moisture in the brain because they were thinking that epilepsy, your brain is too moist. There is too much water in it, so you gotta be collecting it. And your shit is the absorption agent. Despite the fact, when you ingest anything, and I mean anything, it goes to your stomach. But they didn't do dissections. They had no idea what's going on in your body. So their logic was just faith. If you think about it, doctors back in the day were some great manipulators and charlatans. Now let's get to the category that we were looking forward to, because there were some real documented cases. And the first case is Charles II. And I bet some of the people know about this case, but I would like to remind you about this case because Charles II of England, 1685, he was killed by medicine and not by disease. So Charles II had a seizure. His physicians rushed in and did everything the medical textbooks have recommended. So what they did, they have drained 2 pints of blood immediately. And what is 2 pints, you might ask? Is 1.1 liters. 20 to 25% of your blood volume of your body. Your symptoms already from that. You would experience weakness, pale skin, increased heart rate, anxiety, thirst. This is your body starting to struggle because there's not enough blood for you to be pumping. That's what they did because of that seizure. They gave him an emetic to force vomiting. Basically a substance that causes you to vomit. So not only he was already weak, they made him vomit everything out. They gave purgative to induce diarrhea. They gave a laxative on top of that and applied blistering agents to peel the skin off. They forced down powdered skull and some stone. Not ingestible, bro, that's literally cannibalism. Placed hot cups on his skin. After doing the blistering, they placed hot cups on his skin because he was probably shivering because he was not having enough blood. One, he was vomiting, so dehydration and diarrhea, extreme dehydration and thirst, and they did more bloodletting, so that's draining more blood the next day in order to try to prevent for him not to have another seizure. But this man was already hella weak. They did another purge. Then because he was weak, they were like, oh, we gotta bleed him again. We gotta bleed him again, man, because that's what it says. And we believe that's what should be working. He died within 5 days. He died within 5 days because those physicians were doing everything by the book that they were studying without having the actual experience. You know, they didn't do the trial and error. I mean, this is a clear trial and error, but they had 300 years to do that trial and error, and they have decided to go ham on this one, and especially on Charles II of England. But the modern historians say he would have survived if they did nothing at all, because he just had a seizure. If they just let him be, rest, drink some water, I don't know, some wine, just he wouldn't be fine. They would have not known what was happening with him regardless, because they had no idea of how the brain works and how what seizures are being caused. However, he would have probably lived a bit longer than 5 days. Next case, our man, George Washington. Yes, and he has fallen to be the victim of hands of doctors that had no idea what they were doing. He had bled to death. The first US president, still under the humoral medicine. He developed a throat infection and doctors removed 2.5 liters of blood. That's over 40% of his total blood volume. When do you die, you may ask? That's life-threatening. That's when your organs start to fail. It will lead to shock and death. To which what had happened? They have also given enemas. And you might be asking, what are enemas? And it's a procedure where liquid is inserted into the rectum to clear the bowel. So they were trying to really get him squeaky clean inside, you know? Suck him dry. Gave emetics. What could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? They have applied blistering agents. They believe the infection created an excess of blood, hot and moist humor, so removing blood would cool the system inside his body. Yeah, he died very quickly. This is 1799, my G's. Last but not least, there was a really interesting case of a doctor, the plague doctor who survived in 1619. There was a plague doctor in Paris, survived while tending to hundreds of victims. People thought he had a miracle recipe. Everybody was just questioning, what does this doctor know that we don't know about? It just turns out he was washing his hands with vinegar between patients. He thought the vinegar balanced miasma. Miasma was the bad air. You know, it was balancing the bad air because vinegar is very strong in the scent. That's why in a lot of masks that they were wearing, like example the Black Plague mask, they were wearing the beaks and everything. Inside of there, they were putting herbs because they were thinking that there was also the miasma theory that the air was polluted. Technically, they kind of had an idea that maybe there is like bacteria, but they were not thinking of it that way. Didn't think that bacteria or viruses have been transferring like that. And in his case, he was using vinegar to wash his hands, and also because of the scent of the hands between the patients. But in reality, this vinegar, due to its acid, it killed bacteria. So when he was going from patient to patient, it just killed the bacteria, and that helped to survive him through the plague. Pure accidental science that he had figured out. So looking at all of this, I'm just so grateful for right now because we have modern medicine. People are investing funds into research, into finding out what works best, what antibiotics are working best, because what they're saying right now that antibiotics that have to progressively be changing because our bodies adapt to antibiotics. Some of the antibiotics our body and the viruses that enter our body already are not going to be affected as much, so they're not going to be as effective. So people are trying to develop better antibiotics now. What that means is that back in the day, the cluelessness of how anything works and people just trusting blindly. Right now, we have all of these online reviews. We have all these cases of credibility, of people telling their stories if anything goes wrong, lawsuits. People are genuinely afraid to be doctors because they're taking on responsibility of another person's life. It's a very thin line between you potentially ruining your life or you saving someone's life, and people are still going to be thanking God at the end of the day instead of them. But it's already better. People are still already progressing. So next time when you are thinking that your doctor is not prescribing you the correct medicine or is not prescribing you the right thing that they should be, or they're not looking after you as they should be, just be thankful that they're not advising you to be wearing rooster testicles around your neck or drinking dried up dog penis in your wine, because it sure is better to have some medicine that they're trying out and seeing if it works for you than for you to be doing all that crazy stuff. Stay curious, stay healthy, and I don't know, I just dwell here.